Well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar today. Couple quick housekeeping items. We have everybody muted, just cuts down on a lot of background noise. So if you have questions as we go through, we do have another team member that can answer any questions you put up in chat, in the Zoom chat. So if you just put questions up there, we'll answer them as we go through, or if there's any that I need to answer, we can do those at the end. We'll also give you some contact information because there's a lot of information we're going to go through in a very quick manner just to get it all in. So it may lead you to have some more questions after we wrap up today, but happy to set up a one-to-one call or Zoom to answer any questions, walk through the rest of the process. Really just want to welcome everybody. I'm Mike McCarty. I'm the CEO of Safe Hiring Solutions, former violent crime detective. I started Safe Hiring 16 years ago. We are headquartered in Danville, Indiana. We have another office in Crawfordsville, Indiana. Our leadership team, very diverse leadership team. Some of our leaders and advisors come out of law enforcement like myself, some with the FBI, some Secret Service. We've got Navy SEALs. So we've got really a unique group of leaders and advisors that help us really drive a lot of the 360 solutions that we offer. We work with about 70% of Indiana schools in some form or fashion. We work with thousands of schools across the United States. We work with districts as large as Tampa, Hillsborough County schools in Florida, which is the 7th largest school district in the United States, down to single building charter schools. Quantas International, we have about 7,000 clients across the United States. Some of you, looking at the registration, have been clients for a long time. And, many of you may have started when we were a background screening firm, and that's all we were, was a background screening firm. But we've really grown into much more than a background screening firm over the last 6 or 7 years. We do background checks. We even have newer background check solutions like Arrest Alert, which is a real-time arrest notification. So think about, I do a background check, and then we do another background check. So in Indiana, on employees or vendors, contractors, that's a 5-year recheck. Well, a lot can happen in a 5-year period. Arrest Alert can provide a real-time notification. If anybody's been arrested anywhere in the United States, we have automated reference checking platforms. We are literally, as I speak, rolling out the Learning Zone, which is a online training management system that integrates within the processes and all the solutions we have. Obviously, we're going to talk about threat assessment or security assessments today. We have visitor management systems, say visitor solutions, and that wraps up into some of the COVID and, mobile applications and COVID questions and some of the checking that's going on today before allowing anybody to come on premise. So what are we really talking about today? Well, this goes back to 2019, House Enrolled Act 1004, where part of that legislation that was passed has a requirement for schools in Indiana, both public and private and charter, to complete a threat assessment. Here's kind of that snippet of language. There's really no definition within the statute of what this means. And I'm going to get to kind of what the guidance that came out from the Department of Ed. Clearly, they are talking about, when they say conduct a threat assessment for each school building, they're having you focus on your buildings. The honest answer is it's a little, the language is a little bit unique because a threat assessment, kind of a standard definition nationally, that is a behavioral assessment that's conducted on people, i.e. in a school setting. Typically that's students. You're doing an intervention or a behavioral intervention based on red flags. And so Um, Really what this statute appears, and the DoE guidance kind of confirms this, it's a vulnerability assessment. And so we'll walk through that process here in just a little bit. So, you know, the statute language being, more consistent with the vulnerability assessment, the DOE guidance that came out confirms, using the language of a vulnerability assessment in their guidance, kind of advises you to create an assessment team. I think they provide some direction or ideas about, potentially school districts sharing resources. So maybe having school resource officer or school safety specialist from school A go to school B and provide that assessment process. There's always value in third party eyes on looking at, organizations that are not their own. They may see things that we walk past every single day and see, but these are just a little bit of guidance. There are paper forms I think the DOE has put out that could help you and your team actually walk through and conduct a vulnerability threat assessment that would comply. They talk about utilize an all hazards approach. And so this is when you think in terms of doing this assessment and on the buildings, it's think beyond just active shooter. And so there's a lot of recommendations within the DOE guidance talking about like cyber networks, environmental, terrorism, natural, think in terms of tornadoes or other natural events. So really broadening the scope of this assessment process to really create kind of a 360 assessment of the organization. Then they recommend selecting an assessment tool. Most of the tools I think that I saw are, they're more paper-based or kind of one and done type models. And I'm going to share with you an opportunity to create kind of a working, breathing assessment process that you would do continuously. And it helps to not only determine risk and prioritize where you focus, but it also then helps you move that needle as you make changes and implement, process changes. Some of those may be, as simple as removing, environmental shrubs, things in front of the building that may allow somebody to hide or not be visible. So as you make changes, not only having a list of recommendations, but you're updating that within the tool. So you have a running system of what you're accomplishing. And then the assessment becomes part of the school safety plan. So again, it's a breathable, ongoing process. Typically, most of the assessments have been treated as a one and done because especially pre-COVID, the majority of vulnerability assessments that were being promoted to schools were third parties coming on site, conducting these assessments, and they can be extraordinarily expensive. And I think I list some numbers here in a little bit. And so it didn't really offer the ability to create a long-term process for continually managing the vulnerability and risk within the environment. And so this approach would really encourage from the DOE that it becomes part of your school safety plan. So it's an ongoing roadmap and process for constantly and continually assessing any vulnerabilities. And so they, in their language from the DOE, it's a continuous process to review, revise, and reassess, constantly changing. Things change, threats change, opportunities to, vulnerabilities, especially when we start talking about technology and cyber. And if you've paid any attention to news over the last couple months, especially right before the holidays and coming out of the holidays. A lot of cyber attacks on public school systems and ransomware and shutting, school systems completely down, some of them for weeks, as they lose access to all of their networks. And then the end result of the assessment on an annual basis is it helps you both the results will drive and prioritize funding requests. And so the end result of the requirement coming up, you have to conduct this, and it needs to be done by July 1st, 2021 to be able to apply for grants. And then you have to certify to Homeland Security that you have completed this. And so I know there's been a lot of questions. Well, what does this mean? What is the threat assessment? And again, the statute is very vague and unclear. So we're going to work through this guidance from the Indiana Department of Education. So what is a vulnerability or a threat assessment? We would call this a vulnerability assessment when we're talking about assessing the buildings. Most focus on the physical. If you look at, especially if we go back even to Sandy Hook, Sandy Hook was an anomaly on so many levels. One, the fact that it was an elementary school. So there's just a lot of anomalies. It shoots its way into the building. And I think by virtue of how that particular assassin came into the school, it caused us to really focus a lot on the physical aspects of buildings and school safety. What we want to create here is, the physical is one aspect of keeping a school safe. And quite honestly, we want to make sure we spend a lot of time on the behavioral and the threat assessment side too. That is where we're going to move the needle towards prevention and connecting flags and preventing these events. So a lot of it's focused on locks and doors and cameras. And I bet if I could see each and every one of you on the webinar, and I ask you to raise your hand if you've been inundated with vendors selling everything under the sun, every single one of you are going to raise your hand, especially post Parkland. There have just been so many vendors selling so many things, from bullet resistant or what they would call bulletproof backpacks to, just everything you can imagine. And it's really playing on people's fears. And so what we want to do is really assess the risk, look at it from a 360 perspective. When you look at a lot of third parties, the cost in a lot of these vulnerability assessments was the sheer labor in sending teams to your school and conducting these assessments. And the expense can range anywhere from $1,500 to $5,000 per building, not district, but per building. So, a 5-building school district, this is going to cost you anywhere from $7,500 to $25,000 to get a one-time assessment with a list of recommendations. And it's not collaborative. And so, that is a very expensive process. We were moving towards a virtual environment pre-COVID. And a lot of our non-school clients were asking for this because we work with thousands of church and ministries of all sizes, thousands of volunteer organizations. And our volunteer and church communities were saying, hey, look, we need this. We saw a church shooting, December 30th in Texas. We need these systems, an assessment process, but we cannot afford that labor and that cost. And so we were bringing a virtual model to the market. And I think COVID has helped all organizations understand how much you can actually do in a virtual environment. So we really believe that we want to collaborate with your team. Your team knows your buildings inside and out. They know your culture. They know everything about your organization. There may be some things that we recognize or understand that we can help with. And we did this a couple years ago, actually, with a Indiana school district. We did more of a collaborative process where we came with their team and went building to building and did this more of a conference. So that was really where we got the idea about creating an assessment tool that you can use as a school district. It becomes a living, breathing document, that ongoing process. And then the recommendations based on conducting this assessment are going to provide you with the best options and recommendations for making your school safer. We have spent literally the past, I don't know, 3 years evaluating hundreds and hundreds of security solutions that are being marketed to schools. And we have narrowed it down to who are the best. And when we say best, it has to be an extraordinarily quality product. It has to move the needle in terms of safety and security. It's not just something shiny and looks really good, but it has to really provide value and safety for the school. And it's got to be affordable. So there's a balance between what it does, how it works, and does it integrate together so that your products speak to each other. Who has helped us drive this virtual assessment? So we've got an advisory board that have deep experience. Tony is a former Navy SEAL, so he looks at things very differently than law enforcement officers look at it. Paul Dvorak, Paul was on George W. Bush's security detail. He's provided security and led it at the UN on 2 different General Assemblies. Dottie, former Deputy Chief of Police in Fort Wayne, led security at Fort Wayne Community Schools. Paul Finnewald retired from the FBI and worked for the Missouri School Boards Association for many years. He still runs a think tank throughout the United States. It's a monthly call, and a lot of your DOEs and the federal DOE participate in this. So these are deep thinkers that understand prevention, and they've helped as we've created this assessment tool. It's going to look at a lot of different aspects of your school district. We're going to review policies. Just as an example, we're going to look at background screening policies. I bring that up because our team has talked to at least a half dozen school districts in Indiana just over the last 4 or 5 months that are still not in compliance with the expanded criminal history checks for current employees. There's a 5-year recheck that was passed, I think 4 years ago. And so they're coming up on that 5-year mark, and these schools had not implemented that required process. And so those are some of the things we're going to address, in the policy review, is to ensure that your policies are up to date, you're in compliance with anything the state's requiring that you should be doing. And it will also benchmark best practices. Do a safety and security climate survey, which we'll talk about, a physical assessment, which is looking at the buildings and the hardware and the locks and access control and all of those features. Technology. So if you read through the DoE guidance, it's easy to kind of move over this rather quickly, but there's a technology piece there. And so it fits within that cyber environment. And now that we've moved into, virtual and hybrid school, which, may be here forever. And with that, how are we securing those virtual environments as well as our internal networks? Cyber piece, and then the threat and behavioral. And so when I talk about the threat and behavioral, we're talking about people. We're talking typically primarily about students and intervening with students when we have red flags that are surfacing. So I mentioned some of the policies, your safety plan, the screening, the requirements, for vendors. What are you doing with volunteers, technology, student drop off and pickup. We've done assessments for schools, where we physically have, set outside of excuse me, outside of schools and watch the drop off and pick up each day to just evaluate, the safe manner and the ways in which this is being handled. The Safety and Security Climate Survey, this really is a component of an assessment, and this really is the foundation. This is where I would start, because this is where you really get a glimpse into how everybody in your organization feels about safety and security. This is kind of a random sampling of stakeholder survey. This is anonymous. So, you can create as many stakeholders as you want. This could be admin, it can be principals, assistant principals, teachers, classified staff, nurses, school resource officers, public facing employees, those that are interacting with the public. Um, and so as you create these, you'll notice that it's going to be scored based on that stakeholder, and it's going to be color coded. And so what you can do is you can use this as a benchmark as you start. How do our people feel? Yeah, maybe we have policies, but how does somebody facing the public every day feel compared to a teacher? Or what we found in some school districts is, how do people working in a building without students feel versus those that are working in buildings with students? And they found there was a disconnect, that there had been a lot of emphasis on buildings with students, and some of the employees working in buildings without students didn't feel as safe. And so this can provide a great benchmark as you start this assessment process, where you can come back and evaluate this on a annual basis, but it gives you a snapshot into, and then you can compare it. So if I've got 10 or 11 different stakeholders, I can start to see, hey, my safety specialist in this example, they feel higher or better about safety and security, far more than our nurses do. But our SROs are less than the specialists, staff. And so you start to get a sense, and then you can drive down. So there's a number of questions that are included here, and you can go down and look at the categories. We break them into different categories. So then you can compare each category. Then you can go down and look at each question. So it really provides an overall, it's like sticking a thermometer in the mouth of your organization and taking their temperature. How do they feel today? And then as you start to implement these changes that come out of a safety or vulnerability assessment, then we come back in a year and you do this again, and we start to see, is it moving our employees toward feeling safer when they're at work? And so that one is really a great place to start. The physical, you're going to look at the buildings. You're going to, determine policy versus practice. You're going to look at the CEPTID, which is really crime prevention through environmental design. You're going to look at extensive, assessment of locks and cameras and door propping, and the technology that can alert you. I've talked to many, many schools doing the assessments, and, at 2:00, they prop open the back door, or this door's left open, or people come in and out of this door and it's not always locked, or it doesn't, I talked to a school actually this week, and the security officer in that building was saying, he found out, the janitor was to go around, check locks every single day, found out he'd had a lock on a door that had been broken for weeks. And what he also found was nobody was going around and checking it like they were supposed to. And so looking at, access control, how do you manage the flow of people in and out of buildings, especially post-COVID? I know that the numbers are a lot lower today because of restrictions, but as we move back towards normal, how are they coming into the building? Who's coming into the building? Do we know who they are? How have they been screened? What's our policies related to, I'm coming in to have lunch with a student? Do we treat that as they need to be screened like you would a volunteer, or do we not? Classroom doors, I want to make sure also that some of the things we have done because of COVID are not also adding more risk to our schools. And, one of the things we've heard a lot is, instead of locking the doors, and we know if you look at Parkland, one of the things we know, and it's very consistent with a lot of these school shootings, he moved right past the doors that were shut and locked. And so now I'm hearing of policies where they're opening doors for more ventilation. And so, making sure some of our policies may not be creating a perfect storm where it's creating more risk in our schools on the other side from a behavioral perspective. Technology, security technology, visitor management, volunteer management, alert systems, access control, student check-in and check-out. Do these systems integrate? You want them to speak to each other. And we've spent a long, many years really looking at not only the best in suite, but how do you get the best of the best to then integrate and communicate with each other and share data. And now from a management perspective, as a school administrator, a security administrator, you're not managing 6 or 7 disparate systems, but you're managing a system that works together and communicates with each other. We're really excited because we're rolling out a cyber piece, and this is in response to kind of a lot of what we've been seeing outside of the active shooter and some of the other security and vulnerability risk is this proliferation in the cyber ransomware attacks recently, and securing your virtual environments. For the most part, for K12, a lot of this has really been out of your range in terms of being able to afford to do this. And so we've partnered locally with Nick Sturgeon. Nick was with the Indiana State Police for 8 years. He ran their cyber investigative unit. He then went over to the state of Indiana and ran the Fusion Center. He went to a company called Pondurance. For those of you in the Indianapolis area, you may have heard of Pondurance. I mean, they're a very well-respected cybersecurity firm, but not something that a school district can generally afford to do. And so Nick also leads cyber for IU Health, has created a program with us that allows schools to very affordably be able to not only assess, just like you're assessing all your other vulnerabilities, assess what vulnerabilities you have within your networks. It can range from an assessment to penetration testing. And so a whole suite of solutions, because it becomes an ongoing process. And so, we'll be sharing more information about that as well. But it really, for the first time, I think, provides an extraordinarily excellent product and service at an extremely affordable price for not only schools, but non-for-profits and small businesses. The last piece of our tool, it will be able to implement a behavioral threat assessment. So managing, your crisis team or your threat assessment team, the intervention tool. And there are a number of them. If you're not overly familiar with behavioral threat assessment, I'm going to put my information up here in a minute. You can ping me, call me, email me. I'll be happy to show. There's several validated tools. You do not have to recreate anything here. It's simply taking whatever tool you use. Some schools use blended tools because they like pieces of multiple of these tools that are out there. But you can create a threat assessment intervention tool within this assessment process. And so now when you start to manage the red flags, and this is where Parkland really struggled, because they had multiple red flags on Cruz the shooter, but they were all held in siloed areas. So, a police officer, a school resource officer had information, a counselor, a principal. I mean, even the FBI was getting information. All of this was siloed. So maybe I'm looking at it from my silo and I see one flag, and one flag doesn't necessarily bring me over the top. Had I looked in here and saw connected red flags, then we're starting to see a pattern. And the idea behind behavioral threat assessment, this is not a punitive process. What we're really looking at with these behavioral threat tools, this is helping kids. This is end goal is it may prevent an event from happening at your school, but it's really to meet kids where they're at. And I think we all know, in this COVID environment, when we see the suicidal ideations and threats, and we have a partner that has worked in the training and suicide prevention space for 40 years, and the numbers they are telling us are just staggering. What they're seeing. And so clearly, as we're dealing with this and start to come out of this in the near future, hopefully, I think you're going to have a perfect opportunity here where this is such an important part of this process, because you're really helping kids, you're intervening for them, you're connecting them with services. So it's not like an active shooter prevention program. This is helping kids program and making sure with their mental health that we get them what they need to be successful. So that was a lot of information. I know we run up on about a minute over. I'm going to put my contact information up here. Feel free to email me. You can call me directly. If you want more information on, how this tool works, what this tool would cost, any of those questions, happy to answer those. Set up a time to go through this a little more slowly if you want to go through it with your team and ask questions. All right. Do we have any questions? I am not seeing any questions. We did record this, so if anybody else on your team would like to review this, we'll have it up on the website probably within, the next couple days. Otherwise, we appreciate you taking time out of your busy day. We know you're very, very busy, and we hope you have a great afternoon. Thanks.